Hello and welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. Now, if you're watching this episode, you may notice one thing very different about it. And before you ask, no, this is probably not going to be negotiable. I have no clue why, but this is just something that I've wanted in a podcast for so long, and I finally figured out that I could do it. It's been a feature in the software for a while, and it wasn't until I updated it that I actually saw it was a thing, and I am keeping it forever. I am really close to the cusp of my 200th episode, and I'm still making changes to the format. I know this adds a little bit of work, and really isn't important to the ones who just put me in the background while they do something else, but for those who don't do that, you get a little something extra. You're the real troopers here. With me fawning over a literal line out of the way, let's get right into the news. First, the last update on Honduras for the time being, because it appears that things are actually going to be better for Honduras. Now you might say, wait, wasn't Xiomara's election the thing that made it better? Well, I was a little bit concerned because a lot of things were happening in Honduras that made me go, uh-oh, is something bad gonna happen? But it seems that the situation has quelled itself. The Libre dissidents that did that whole thing where they launched a separate Congress because they wanted to support someone else for the president of the National Assembly. Well, the guy who they put in charge, Jorge Calix, basically decided that he will step aside, allow for the person who was supposed to be the head of the National Congress, Luis Redondo, the ability to take her position as per the agreement that she had with Nasrallah's party, and 18 of the 17 dissidents that remained rejoined Libre. So it looks like for the time being, we get to sigh a bit of relief. Another thing in Latin America was an election that I didn't necessarily know if I wanted to talk about, but what happened basically solidified that I'm probably not going to talk about it, at least after this episode. Costa Rica has begun their nomination, they basically begun their process to selecting their president. They held their election a little bit before last week, literally right as the last week ended and this one began. And in the runoff, there were a couple of candidates that were pretty good. Apparently Costa Rica's incumbent president was actually pretty good. The incumbent president was a guy from the Citizens Action Party, which was a center-left party in Costa Rica. And due to term limits or whatever, he couldn't run again. So they basically held it normally, people normally do. They held an election. And the results did not bode well for the Citizens Action Party. They got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10th place in the election. Though to be fair, that's 10th in a field of 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. 10th of 25. So this race was pretty much guaranteed to go to a runoff. And as is typical with these sort of runoff systems, usually that entails sort of more moderate candidates kind of reach the top. This isn't always the case. Peru had someone who was running as a Marxist, running against the daughter of a dictator, and in Chile, we had a libertarian socialist running against a literal fascist. So these aren't necessarily the rules, but in this case, it kind of is, because the two people that ended up making it to the runoff were a man by the name of Rodrigo Chavez Robles, the Costa Rican Minister of Finance during the incumbent president's tenure, who is running under the Social Democratic Progress Party, which has the ideology of social democracy, social liberalism, reformism / third way. So basically, on a Twitter battle, he would be a sock. And the other person who managed to make it to the runoff was a man by the name of Jose Maria Figueres, who was the former president of Costa Rica from 1994 to 1998. And the banner that he is running under is the National Liberation Party, a social democratic third way party, basically similar to him. It's moderately, it's like a liberal / social democratic-ish party, like a left lib party. Like, I mean, he actually faced a lot of critiques from members of his own, like, groupings because he essentially shifted further to the right on economics. Not necessarily, like, based on him, like basically he just became a liberal. So essentially, the runoff is essentially, like, between, like, two sort of third-way-ish social democrats. I mean, it's not like it's a particularly bad situation. I'm pretty sure Costa Rican fans might not necessarily be a fan. They might be a fan or might not be a fan of the previous president running again. So maybe they might just be more inclined to support this other guy because he's just not the former president. Or maybe the former president's ideology, because it apparently is shaping a lot of Costa Rican politics, is going to ride him to the presidency once more. Basically, it's just a nothing burger. You're going to get basically the same thing no matter what. It's not even lesser of two evils. It's literally just bland one, bland two. Now, these next two stories are actually related, and they've got their own little mini category that I have dubbed Republicans Being Based. The first one is really just a funny nothing burger. It's nothing important, but people are making it important. A mayor of Sandy, Oregon, Stan Pulleyman, was recently revealed to have previously been in a group of swingers. For those who don't know what a swinger is, it's where two members in a relationship agree to swap partners with another couple. I might say, why is this interesting? Well, for two reasons. One is that apparently Pulleyman is a, quote, leading gubernatorial candidate, meaning he, at the very least, has a decent chance of becoming the Republican nominee. But the other reason why it's interesting is because he's not backing down at all. Like, I mean, he was revealed to be in a swingers group, and people were like, thought like, oh, this is it, he's over. But he's literally just like, so what if I was in a swinger group? Me and my wife made our own consensual decision of what we wanted to do with our relationship. So what? And it's actually like, oh, that's an interesting surprise. Like, I mean, this is the kind of scandal that would kill a politician a while ago, but he's literally just like, no, I'm not backing down. So what? Now that's interesting. But of course, it's just like, this guy's just like also just a normal average Republican. So, I mean, that's just kind of where his baseness ends. This other guy, his baseness actually has something to do with his policies. Okay, so Arizona has been recently trying to crack down on transgender healthcare. And a state senator by the name of Tyler Pace actually saved the healthcare plan. In the Arizona legislature, he was on the Health and Human Services Committee, which currently has 5 Republicans on it. So basically it was like, oh, we can win. It was an easy win. But then Tyler Pace voted with the Democrats, making it a 4-4 vote, effectively killing the bill. And he explained his reason why was very simple. The testimonies we heard today about the many people who are using these avenues of medical treatments to save lives, to improve lives, he said during the committee hearing, I don't want my vote to stop these great things. He's literally just like, look, I actually listen to the stories of the trans people in my community, and I'm actually going to go through with it. And I'm actually going to stand up for them and be like, no, this is a bad thing. We will not do anything to, like, prevent them from getting the help they need for however they need it. And it's actually like, Pace? That's Paced. Tyler Pace, more like Tyler Based. I made the same awful joke twice, so I'm gonna move on. Okay, so the next story is kind of interesting. And it's interesting to the point where, honestly, this is probably gonna start a narrative. Okay, so apparently the website Gawker, which for those of you who have no clue what that website is, it's a website that apparently classifies as journalism. It's like TMZ, but no, it's just TMZ. But Gawker announced, like, randomly just one day, they just posted an article where they're basically like, hey, we like filed some like returns for like Kyrsten Sinema. We like filed for like a bank, FOIA or something like that, and they revealed that they actually got Kyrsten Sinema's social security number. And for a second, I was legitimately convinced that they had posted it as well, because in the article, right under the headline, we have Kyrsten Sinema's social security number, they literally post a number there that looks suspiciously like a social security number, but then they reveal, oh no, this is just from a song, and it's like, oh, phew, because that is definitely, this story is 100% going to be used in the narrative to try and rehabilitate Kyrsten Sinema in some way. I don't know how far the rehabilitation of Kyrsten Sinema can go, but definitely, things like this are just not helping. This could be intentional, or maybe it's not intentional. I don't know. Now, I doubt any progressives are working at Gawker. I really doubt it. Though they keep pretending they are. It seems like the new rebrand of Gawker seems to be like a progressive thing, because I think I remember they posted another article where it's like, Jon Stewart exhumes the last shred of dignity he has to defend Dave Chappelle or something like that. But it's just like, honestly, Gawker is just like trash. It's literally just trash news. But stunts like this are definitely not going to spread the right message. Speaking of messages, Cori Bush is not going to be backing down on her message. You see, because apparently Democrats are really, really mad at Defund the Police. Now, remember, for those who don't remember, this is what the Democrats blamed their, losses in 2020 on. Yes, the losses of winning the White House and winning the Senate and keeping your majority in the House. How dare Defund the Police do this? And they've literally asked Cori Bush to essentially tone down your message, but she said, no, I'm not backing down. She ran on Defund the Police, so she's going to continue running on Defund the Police. And this, again, everybody's pointing to this out already, this is essentially Democrats trying to point the finger very early on for their losses. Distract from the fingers being pointed at the direct, at the actual direction that people are pointing to. Because this is how it always is. Every time the moderates kill something, the progressives are the ones who get blamed. The moderates are the ones who basically gutted Obamacare to the point where it was completely pointless. And yet the progressives are the one that got the blame, because it's like, oh, you guys introduced this massive healthcare bill. Oh no. Members of the Democratic caucus in the Senate who voted for these right-wing Supreme Court justices and run basically as Republicans lost to Republicans? What? But how? It must be the far left's fault. What's that? There is a slogan about defund the police that actually expanded members of the House in a specific ideological caucus? But the people who didn't run on it and actually ran vehemently opposed that? No. You see, them being opposed to it was the right decision. We need to invite these guys on every single news thing so that we can talk to them and see how we can win. It's like, oh my god, how can you keep falling for this same stupid trap? Literally every time a progressive wins and the moderates lose, it seems that they flip the blame. A progressive won the Democratic primary? Wow, it was all thanks to the moderates. And it's like, wait, what? How did they moderate loss in the general election? Must have been the progressives' fault. Democrats seriously blamed the freaking far left over losing seats that were easily keepable or flippable, and they blame the far left. Claire McCaskill. Why is she being invited on any news show to talk about a victory? Now, here's the thing. People keep saying, she won a people, I remember seeing an actual argument where someone said, we need to, Claire McCaskill's 2016 campaign for her Senate seat is such a model to behold. And it's did you see when she tried to use that same strategy in 2020? That didn't pan out so well, did it? I think it was 2014 or I probably got the dates wrong on that, but you get my point. They like to seriously look at a idea so long gone that it's just not how it works. The moderates being the victory speech, like the ones who are the ones who are winning, that's not how it works. They took the wrong message. It's never been the moderates. It's literally never been the moderates. It's always how you run your campaign. Like, all of this stems back to Reagan in the 80s. Reagan managed to flip a bunch of Democrats to support him. Like, Dems wanted them back, but also wanted to take some more of the Republicans with them. And they thought the strategy was run more right-wing. No, but that wasn't what it was. Because Reagan, he didn't run like super... Barry Goldwater, he did terribly in one election cycle. But he didn't, Reagan didn't, the reason why Goldwater lost was because Goldwater was a terrible person. He was a terrible candidate. Not because he was far right. That may have played a part in it, but it's how you run the campaign. Reagan had to popularize his own ideas through his, folksy attitude, and that's what Clinton did. And that's what a lot of other Democrats did. They didn't just run as, we're the moderate, or we're the right wing, or whatever. They ran as the folksy type. The same era of, Clinton gave us Paul Wellstone, Harris Woodford, and a bunch of others. They were not ideologically aligned with Clinton. They had similarities, but it wasn't that what got them in their offices. It was their attitude and how they campaigned and how they espoused their ideas. Watch the debate between him, Ross Perot, and George H.W. Bush. They ask a question to get to the core of the people. They say, how has our economic problems affected you personally? Perot and Clinton were smart and actually campaigned with that in mind. They were explaining their issues, but in a personal manner. Although Clinton could have said I believe we need our far right economics, Reagan 2.0, but me. He could have said that, but he didn't. He explained personal things, here's how it affected me. I go down the street and I see people who need to get welfare and blah blah blah. He campaigned with the rural populist vibe. That's what won him the seat, not the fact that he was a centrist. And even the centrists that do end up winning, they don't win because, we're the centrist, we're the middle ground types. They don't win because of that. They win because of their personal things. Joe Manchin, he won because he's a governor that people know and like, and they like his personality. Granted, they're not being as favorable to it now, but they were. Kyrsten Sinema ran a personal campaign of she's going to be the first bisexual senator. Well, first open bisexual senator. Jared Golden ran on his military record and how that has affected him and how that helps him work with people he might not necessarily agree with. Sure, they slip in their politics here and there, but it's more of the people rather than the actual philosophies of the people. Speaking of philosophy, now we get into the main topic of this video, and this is another one of those thinky topics where I pose a question, a sort of essay, a video format, if you will. The question of this episode stems from a very interesting source. People who are probably 12 years old on Twitter. The place where all of the deep philosophical questions lie. For those who have not read the title or whatever, the question is simple. Should we read theory? That's a topic that's been heavily debated amongst the online left in particular. Because honestly, the right could care less if you read their theory or not. In fact, they don't even call their stuff theory, I don't think. Theory really does seem to be more of a left-wing issue more than a right-wing issue. Now, for those who don't know, what is theory? Theory is a political philosophy. Not a tendency, but a philosophy, philosophers' books, doing something to try and explain your politics in some manner, but not in a like policy way, but more in like I said, a philosophical sense. Like, should we morally do this, or should it be ethical to do that? A way to shape your outlook on the world. And there have been a lot of debates online in regards to whether or not we should or should not read theory. A common interaction will be that if someone disagrees with you, they will say to simply read theory, and you will understand where they're coming from. The most particular ones will be like, read Marx or read Lenin or whatever. And the most particular book that they'll probably be telling you to read is the one that is in the thumbnail, Capital. Basically saying like, oh, if you read this, you'll understand, you'll get it. My arguments will make sense to you. Now, the way I decided to format this episode was basically very simple. I was actually going to just flat out go over the reasons why we should and shouldn't. Now, before we continue, I should make this abundantly clear. This is my opinion. I will do my best to try and explain my opinions and why I think the way I do in a very poignant, note-driven fashion. But at the end of the day, you're free to listen to this and go, well, no, and then just go on about your day. But I would encourage you, try to watch up to the end so that you can at the very least see whether or not the reactions of one side or the other are justified. Because even if you are on the side of one side, you may think, well, okay, but I don't view this as this, I view it as this. Like, maybe you are on one of the two sides, but then you see how this particular side that you've chosen has reacted, and you might go, well, okay, but yeah, but I don't agree with that part, obviously. And maybe you could formulate your own arguments as to why or why not I should do this, and then post it in the comments or whatever. You're free to do whatever you want. So anyways, I've delayed standing on the tiptoes long enough. Let's finally get into the reasons why we should or shouldn't read theory. First, we will start with the reasons why we should read theory. We should read theory because it allows us to be more informed about philosophy, economics, history, etc. And hopefully with that and better information in mind, we can actually come to better conclusions on how to approach our forms of governance, or forms of trying to attain governance, or forms of advocacy or whatever. That's an argument that you can't really argue against. Like, oh, read this book to be more informed. I mean, yeah, everybody can be more informed. And we do actively try to encourage people to be more informed about the world and whatever. And these books could be a way to be more informed. This is the moment where I have lost all of the theory heads, because that is where the arguments end. Now let us move on to the reasons why we shouldn't read theory. Okay, the first one is actually a rebuttal to, like, the reason why we should read theory. While yes, it is good to have the information that these books provide. I'm not arguing that the people who have read Capital, or the people who've read Lenin quotes or whatever, it's good to have the information, but is it needed? And that's kind of where things start getting a bit iffy with certain people on the left. Because rather than viewing theory as another thing that could help us become more informed, they essentially view it as a leftist Bible. Like Capital in particular. Like, I've been in so many arguments where they've literally just said, just read Capital and you'll get it. Just read Capital and you'll understand why we need the mega socialist revolution, or whatever they're arguing for in that particular moment. The argument never seems to be like, oh, I think you should read Capital as a way to help get more informed. It's literally, the argument seems to be more of, you need to read Capital. Like, they are mad at me that I haven't. It basically comes off as like a Christian. It's like, oh, you haven't read the Bible? Or in a more sense for people who might not get that, it's basically like a guy in a GameStop with another guy, and he's like, and then one guy just casually goes, Oh, yeah, I like Star Wars. I saw what's it? Revenge of the Sith. Yeah, it was a pretty cool movie. I liked it. It was like dramatic and all this stuff. And then this other guy goes, "Have you seen the Star Wars, the Clone Wars movie?" Of course, I'm not talking about the Clone Wars TV show, but I'm talking about the movie pilot that was made to promote it that George Lucas put in movie theaters. Nah, man, I don't think I've seen that one. Then you are not a real Star Wars fan. That's basically what it is. Like, oh, you haven't read Capital, therefore you are not a leftist. Therefore you cannot grasp these complex political issues. Now, again, I'm not saying you can't read them and then have more information of this, but is it needed? Like, the definition of should literally is like, this is a duty that you must do. Like, you have to get this to understand this situation, but you don't. I literally was like, I finally literally bought like the first volume of Capital, and I was literally like, what's the hubbub for? What's all this reading about? Like, what does people want me to read? And, I mean, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's like, I read like the first chapter, and it's like, this is what they wanted me to read? I thought this was like a philosophy book that was like explaining the depths of like whatever, but they're basically getting me to read an economics textbook from the 1860s. Like, Capital was published in 1867, and we're in 2022. We live in a vastly different society than what 155 years ago was. Like, I mean, for example, like, Capital apparently goes over, like, the, like, ability of, like, scarcity of goods, but it's like, that's not necessarily an issue anymore. We live in a post-scarcity society, essentially, but we're still facing the problems that Marx espouses in the book. He talks about how, oh, we don't have enough resources to feed the homeless or whatever. We have the resources to feed, like, basically everyone in the world, but we just don't. Even though we literally could. We could end world hunger like this. But we don't. Now, I'm pretty sure someone will tell me that in the book it explains why, but it's already obvious why. There's no profit incentive, because people are greedy. Like, this, I don't have to read a book to get this. I don't have to read an 1867 economics book to grasp this. It's not a hard concept to grasp. People are greedy. Some people are incredibly greedy, and some are not greedy. It's essentially hero worship. You want me to read this book because it's written by a guy you like, not because it'll actually give me ways to understand the issues of my society. I can get that by going outside, going on social media, seeing what people need. Emiliano Zapata didn't need to read Capital to understand the plight of indigenous Mexicans and lead them during the Mexican Revolution. Fiorel LaGuardia didn't need to read Marx to understand that minorities in New York City were being treated like crap, and he had to do something to fix it. And I don't need to read an economics book from the 19th century to understand the issues of the 21st century. You can, but you don't need to. And that's one of the big reasons why I made this video, because there are a lot of people who view it as a need, not a added bonus, I guess you could say. And another reason why it's like weird that this is sort of seen as a need is because these books are just really big and complex. Listen to this. That's literally how thick the book is. The book is so thick that men are sliding into its DMs. And yet this is the book that they're basically saying, no, you have to read this to be a leftist. Let me give you a quote from Capital, because this also explains my point. The very same bourgeois mentality which extols the manufacturing division of labor, the lifelong annexation of the worker to a partial operation, and the unconditional subordination of the detail worker to capital, extols them as an organization of labor which increases productivity, denounces just as loudly every kind of deliberate social control and regulation of the social process of production, denounces it as an invasion of the inviolable property rights, liberty, self-determining genius of the individual capitalist. It is characteristic that the inspired apologist of the factory system can find nothing worse to say of any proposal for the general organization of social labor than that it would transform the whole of society into a factory. Now, you may understand what he was saying there, but I genuinely have no clue what any of that means. This may lose me like smart boy points, but I don't care. I genuinely don't grasp that. And that's why this isn't a should. You expect any person, any normal person, to look at that and just go, I get it. And Capital is full of this. It's full of, like, charts and, like, long quotes like this. It took me a while to get the freaking from each according to his ability to each according to his need. And that was a small quote, and that's one that people interpret differently as well. It's a book that was written in a foreign language in an older time period where people not only spoke prim and proper, but this was intended to be a philosophy book, so it was more prim and proper, more like whatever. I was ironically gonna say more bougie, but it's like, I mean, I doubt he wanted that interpretation, but this is the thing that your like college professor would say, and then you'd be like, oh, not something that you see as oh, we have to read this book to understand leftism. I keep going back to that point, but that's the point of this video. Should we read theory? Because this seems to have become a question. It's a should now. Should we or should we not? Now, I actually said something there briefly that we're going to touch upon a little bit further, but I'm going to get into this part next, because this part is kind of the part where they all tie together. These two next points kind of tie together a lot, but this is sort of what I mean. The people who hold these views are like extremely orthodox, and they say that you have to interpret it this way, and that this is the only way. But here's the thing, like, we shouldn't listen to these people, because here's the thing, like, if you hold these kinds of orthodox views, you're very unlikely to budge on certain things, and as such, you're more likely going to find groups of people who hold similar orthodox views. And these groups have become prominent socialist groups around the world and wherever. But here's the thing, groups like that never do well. Groups that hold this like view of like you have to read this theory or you have to cite this specific theorist, they never do well in society. Like 70% of the world is like liberal democracies. Those groups are never going to broaden their base. Now, of course, if you are part of these view groups, you might not even agree that there will be a liberal democracy. You would probably be pushing for the worldwide socialist revolution, but that's a different argument in and of itself. I might address it a little bit later. But like back to the liberal democracies, because again, 70% of the world, so that's probably the most likely scenario you're ever going to get your political points across. These groups do not do well. The Socialist Labor Party, the Socialist Equality Party, the PSL in America, they always get like very small percentages of the vote. Even in like times where groups with socialist perspectives were getting more well known, the Socialist Party of America has always been able to surpass the Socialist Labor Party. The SEP is a factionalized cult that is basically pushed aside, and the PSL, while they've kind of been able to branch off a little bit more, that's actually a little bit because they sort of broadened their base a little bit, not a ton, because the PSL still kind of like stays in its little niche. A foreign example would be the Patriotic Union in Chile. There was a broad left coalition that included libertarian socialist groups, social democratic groups, communist groups, etc. But the Patriotic Union was a group that was basically, oh, we're super communists, that we hate the communists and think the communists are too far right. Yeah, because that's definitely a thing that you people unironically think, apparently, that the Communist Party of their country is too far right. Meanwhile, groups that don't hold these orthodox views and instead broaden their socialist tent a little bit, like Socialist Party of America, DSA, among others, manage to do really well. They don't necessarily say brush off and don't read Capital. I'm pretty sure a lot of them would admire you if you did. Much like a lot of left people on Twitter or Facebook and stuff wouldn't say don't read this book. Like if you want to read the book, they wouldn't discourage you from reading the book, but they're not going to force you to read it either. I'm a member of DSA, but I didn't get like a memo that said like, hey, you gotta read this book or else you're kicked out. Although, to be fair, I don't think these groups would do that either. Maybe they would, I don't know. Maybe the SCP really would. They probably would. But, of course, I'm not saying that they would. Like, oh, you can't join the Star Trek Club unless you see every single episode of the old show, The New Generation, and Deep Space Nine, or whatever else other shows they have. A guy that watched the Chris Pine Star Trek trilogy, he wouldn't be allowed in the club because that ain't real Star Trek, boys. In fact, groups that actually sort of broaden themselves away from this sort of like rigid mentality have actually gotten spikes in membership. The U.S. Communist Party used to be this extremely orthodox fringe group. And then they went to having 75,000 members. They got so prominent and powerful that they had to actually do everything they could to try and stop the Communist Party from growing. And then the Communist Party went back to being a fringe group. And then they stopped being a fringe group. And then they started gaining membership again. Like, I hate to deter again, but I got into an argument with a person on Twitter, and they said, like, oh, the Communist Party membership is actually soaring. You're wrong. And it's like, first of all, I'm talking about when they went from the Popular Front to the what's the other thing? The social fascist thing, where they're like, oh, don't work with Soc Dems, don't work with Dem Socs, don't work with all these other actual people who will help you, but you have to treat them as your enemy. When they changed strategies, all of a sudden they started losing membership. And then, but when they were doing the Popular Front strategy, they were rising in membership. So they had a really high membership, but then they started declining. And second, the rise in Communist Party membership that this person claims to be a part of, like, oh yeah, the Communist Party membership is actually soaring. It's like, that was brought upon because the Communist Party, for the past decade or so, no, more than a decade, since the 90s, since the 80s, I believe, no, yeah, literally since the 80s, they have been endorsing and supporting the Democrats. They publicly supported Jesse Jackson and Walter Mondale and Michael Dukakis. Publicly stated at their at their communist convention, they literally publicly stated that they will work with the Democrats to stop the ultra-right. And that rise was done by Bernie and Trump. Trump was seen as like, oh, he's the perfect fascist to run against. And Bernie, because he made socialism a less dirty word than it was before. So there are many people who are like, I guess communist might not be a dirty word after all. And then join the Communist Party. Another example would be the Japanese Communist Party. They adopted a less stringent view. Like originally they were like, oh yeah, we support Mao, we support Xi Jinping, Deng Xiaoping, and all these other people. But then they drifted away from that. And as such, they have become the most successful communist party in a liberal democracy. Now, some of you might say that that's a side tangent, and I would argue it's not, because this is actual praxis. You can actually be doing things to put your actions into actions. But another reason as to why we shouldn't, this isn't even necessarily why we shouldn't read theory, but why we shouldn't look to it as this sort of gospel. That's what technically all of these are about. This interpretation of theory that people have of it basically being a leftist Bible essentially leads to more factionalization. Many people will look upon specific theorists as gospel while looking at others with immense hatred, and these two groups of people are just never going to get along. For example, if you're from a more anarchist perspective, you might be looking at Kropotkin and be like, this guy's pretty smart, this guy's got it, he knows what he's doing. But then you might look at someone like Lenin and go, this guy's stupid. Dictatorship of the proletariat, fucking idiot. And then people who admire Lenin and don't like anarchism will go like, this guy thinks that we can run a society without a dictatorship of the proletariat? These guys are stupid. Communes aren't going to work. We got to actually take action to stop the bourgeois. And, like, I didn't even need to use that example. I literally could have just said one word. Trotsky. Because Trotsky seems to be... Like, Trotsky and Trotskyists seem to be in the crosshairs for basically everybody on the left. Tankies don't like him because they view him as like a turncoat or whatever. And then, like, people in the libertarian left sphere might not like him because, you know, he's from, like, the authoritarian sphere. People on the left libertarian sphere might like him a little bit because it's like, oh yeah, he went against Stalin. That's pretty cool. But like I said, like, these guys worship heroes so much and they're literally just like, oh, you're bad because you worship this person. Oh, you're bad because you read this person's book. Again, it's like a fan war of religion. You're holding these things to really high standards when you really shouldn't. This was a point I should have gotten into beforehand. Like a little bit, like I don't remember which topic it was. Because the way this podcast is, I have notes, but it's like, I still go based on like my train of thought. But another thing that is really hard for them to accept, which is why at least this factionalization is very simple. A lot of these other theorists try to tackle one major thing. Usually, what the next theorists in the train like to do is go, well, yeah, but this guy got this part wrong, and that's how you're going to lose them. Like, people who admire Marx to a infinitely high standard will probably not look at you favorably if you read Capital and go, well, this part I don't like. I don't think he was right on this part. And then you go, oh, I don't like you. Like, you're going to hate them for that. And if that person's philosophy is based on a philosopher who is essentially trying to fix Marxism or whatever, then you might not look upon them favorably. It's why you have this whole debacle of, like, reform versus revolution. The idea behind Marx was that there was supposed to be an inevitable revolution of the proletariat. But when people said, that's very unlikely to happen, what's more likely to happen is that we're going to try and institute this through reforms, people just didn't like that. They are like, you think that Marx is wrong and that the revolution's not going to happen? How can you actually believe this? However, that's just the factionalization of whatever, like, philosopher you admire. Like, oh, you read, like, Trotsky, or you read Marx, or you read Lenin, or you read Mao. That's the noticeable differences. But there's another form of factionalization that also stems from this, and it kind of morphs into this. Like these two parts are essentially linked, because at the end of the day, this is what usually happens, and I'll explain it once I tell you what it is. And this is a very interesting secret that a lot of these people who are like, you should read theory, don't quite get. People can interpret the same things differently. I can probably find an argument in Capital that proves me right and you wrong, and then you will say that's not what the argument is about. But it doesn't matter. I can interpret it how I want, much in the same way you can interpret it in the way you want. And that's what usually leads to philosophers taking their interpretation of Marxism or whatever, and then turning it into their own ideology. Lenin interpreted Marx's thing differently. He called it Marxism, but others called it Leninism, because Lenin added his own perspectives. He had his own disagreements with Marx. He had his own interpretations of what Marx said. He perceived himself as simply adding to Marx's thoughts. Like, oh, I'm just adding my interpretations to his already existing theory. Others saw it as Lenin basically making his own ideology. Stalin saw what Marx wrote and what Lenin wrote, and then created Marxism-Leninism. Mao saw Marxism-Leninism, and then made Marxism-Leninism-Maoism. And so on and so on. That's what every single political philosophy does. You can find your political philosophy and then translate it back to a previous philosophy that existed. Every single political philosopher has influences and influenced right there, so you can pinpoint an exact tabulation of where the philosophy began. And that's just like building entire philosophies, technically. I'm talking about like even like the most minor aspects of these philosophies, and we can actually use two prominent examples from one person, Vosh. Vosh literally made a video where, using quotes from Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Friedrich Engels, he used those quotes to justify voting for Joe Biden and argued that they would have voted for Joe Biden. Many people said, no, you're misinterpreting what he's saying, or blah, blah, blah. But that's the thing. That's how he interpreted their thoughts. I mean, you can claim all you want that he's purposefully misattributing what they're saying, or purposefully misreading into what they're saying, or that, oh, this proves he hasn't read it, but you have no evidence for that. This is literally like the stupid dress. This is actually exactly like the stupid dress thing that happened. Remember when they posted that dress and it's like, what colors are the dresses? Like, I mean, you and your friends got into arguments all the time. Like, no, it is gold and white, or it is black and blue. Like, you got into those arguments all the time. And as much as you kept saying, you're lying, there's no way you actually believe that it is this color, you can't prove that that is the case. Unless you catch them on hot mic literally admitting that that is what they're doing and they're intentionally screwing with you, you have to go on the idea that that is literally what they interpret. If Vosh read the books and read the quotes and read the philosophy and came to the conclusion that they would have supported Joe Biden, what are you to say that he didn't actually interpret it that way? Keeping on the same Vosh train, here was a recent controversy that he's in that all stemmed from the fact that many people said that he did not interpret dialectical materialism the right way. That is literally the cornerstone of communist thought. And yet he's interpreting it in a completely different manner than how it is actually, like, he interpreted it in a way that other people didn't agree with. The exact same thing can be said about the U.S. Constitution. That's literally just how the basis of U.S. politics works. The fact that we interpret the Constitution in a different way. And not only do people nowadays interpret it in a different way, the people who wrote it interpret it in different ways. The people who actually put pen to paper writing the U.S. Constitution interpreted it completely differently from each other. And yet you're going to say, oh, if they just read capital, we will all come to the same conclusions and we will all inevitably support X. It's the same thing that you can say about every philosophy. If they just read this, they'll get it. That's not how it works. Let me say it one more time for people who will not interpret this video in the way that I'm intending either. While the question posed in this video is why we should or shouldn't read theory, and my explanation has definitely leaned more on one side than the other, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm 100% saying that we should not read theory. But I am saying we shouldn't, in the sense that if you believe that this is like a duty or a litmus test or whatever. And for that reason, I will say we shouldn't. If you genuinely believe that of all the things that you could be doing in order to help your knowledge, is that it should be read a book from the 1800s, and then you'll be better grasped at handling a political situation in 2022. If that's what you honestly believe, I mean, I can't stop you from believing it. I would hope that you would think that that's not a healthy thing to believe, but I still can't stop you. But I would hope that you would, because it's just not really going to help you in the grand scheme of things. Now, to those on the theory side, that literally the only thing that they've ever said is they want you to read it just because they want you to be more informed of history or economics or philosophy or whatever. The ones who do it in a, hey, I think you should read Capital. I mean, if you don't want to, that's fine. But, like, I think you should. Like, those guys, it's fine, whatever. I'm not saying that you I'm not saying that you can't or 100% verifiably should never, ever, 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 ever read capital in your life. But I'm only going about this on the idea of like, it's a litmus test. I will stand 100% against using this as a litmus test. And I'm pretty sure at least a decent number of the pro-theory people will stand on that idea as well. This is more me, of course, expressing certain views about the people who do believe that this is a huge litmus test that should 100% be followed by everybody on the left, or else we're not actually going to get what we need or want, or that they're traitors or whatever. But that's all I gotta say. What do you have to say? Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to notify when a future video mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, check out my articles on the Independent Report, or consider supporting me on Patreon.